I wanted to first talk to you about this report that in lieu of Iran's recent retaliation, or we should just call it a response to Israeli aggression over the past several weeks, the huge missile salvo that it launched into Israel. We had reports of Israel, and this had been kind of days and weeks coming, where Russia has been at the UN condemning Israel's invasion and escalations into Lebanon. And there were even rumors that Benjamin Netanyahu himself was going to give a call to Vladimir Putin to stop Iran from its retaliation. And now, as Israel generally does, Israel is retaliating first and foremost by bombing and taking it out on civilians. Now, this has been occurring not just in Lebanon, but also Syria, where there were reports that there were strikes in and around a Russian airbase, the Kamima Air Base, which houses many various Russian weaponry, fighter jets, etc. But reports now confirm that it was, in fact, a warehouse in and around. Now, Israel is never, ever going to confirm what it's actually done. It doesn't generally like to admit to anything that it does on the war crimes beat and on the military beat. But Russian sources are saying that it was actually a warehouse that Russians and Syrians use to coordinate. So I'm curious about your response to this, given everything that's been going on. Developments have been evolving so fast here, Ben, and I'm wondering what your reaction is to this.
Well, first of all, Israel's doing a good job of isolating itself from every other country on earth except the United States and a few European allies. It's funny because historically, Russia and Israel didn't actually have very bad relations. Well, after the end of the Soviet Union did not have relations with Israel. It recognized Israel essentially as a U.S. client regime, an extension of the U.S. empire. And then after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, there were relations. They weren't bad, but they've been getting steadily worse and worse and worse. And now, really, Israel, the only country it has protecting it is the U.S. and then a few, U.S. protectorates in Europe. And we see that now Israel is constantly attacking not only Russian allies, but now even potentially this Russian warehouse. And you mentioned the United Nations. It's very important to look at what Russian officials have said, not only condemning Israel's crimes in Gaza, but now condemning Israel's war of aggression in Lebanon. And in a meeting of the UN Security Council, after Israel carried out this horrific attack in Lebanon, in which it put explosives in civilian technology like pagers and walkie-talkies and blew them up and killed dozens of people, including civilians, several children, and injured around 3,000 people. And Hezbollah has reported that about 1,500 of its fighters were wounded in this attack, which means that half of the 3,000 people wounded by Israel were civilians. This is a massive terrorist attack. Even the former CIA director, the master of terrorism, Leon Panetta, admitted this was a terrorist attack. And in this meeting of the UN Security Council, the Russian representative referred to this as a terrorist attack. So we've seen that Russia is joining with the global majority, the majority of countries on Earth, primarily in the global South, that are supporting Palestine and opposing Israel's horrific atrocities, genocide, colonialism. And what we also see is that essentially in the past few decades, the U.S. had this strategy where they wanted to try to separate Russia from China and from Iran. And this was famously in the 1990s referred to as one of the greatest threats by the U.S. imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski. He wrote this famous book, The Grand Chessboard, in 1997. He was the former U.S. National Security Advisor. He was the architect of the U.S. proxy war in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, in which the CIA supported the Mujahideen that later became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And he supported them in a proxy war against the Soviet Union, which was intervening to support the Afghan socialist government. Well, anyway, Brzezinski wrote this book, The Great Chessboard, in 1997, in which he famously warned of the danger of what he called an anti-hegemonic coalition consisting of Russia, China, and Iran. He said we must do whatever we can to prevent Russia, China, and Iran from becoming allies. Well, what we've seen in the past few decades is that the US and its close proxy Israel have been pushing China, Russia, and Iran closer and closer together year by year. And at this point, they're essentially allies. I mean, last time we were on, actually, we talked about how China prefers using the term partner because China doesn't want to get bogged down in any, unlike what the US constantly does, looking for excuses to expand its imperial interventions abroad. China does not want to get dragged into military conflicts, but for all intents and purposes, there is now an alliance between China, Russia, and Iran. And these kinds of Israeli attacks on alleged Russian military infrastructure, it's only going to further strengthen that alliance. So the US thinks that it can try to maintain this unipolar imperialist system, try to maintain hegemony over every region on Earth. But meanwhile, all it's actually doing is strengthening these alliances between its adversaries, its so-called adversaries. We shouldn't consider China an adversary. It has no interest in being an enemy, but the US keeps saying that it is. And all of the US is actually doing is strengthening these very anti-hegemonic coalitions that it was concerned about creating in the first place. And of course, this genocide in Gaza and now war of conquest invasion in Lebanon is once again only strengthening that. The US continues to isolate itself on the world stage.
Yeah, and with regard to what we're now seeing in Lebanon, for example, where Russia is condemning what Israel is doing, it's also, I think this was pretty huge, saying that Russia is actually requesting, based upon Israel's own impetus, to evacuate the whole scene in the region in order for it to conduct this absolutely malicious aerial campaign. Russia is actually saying that Russians should evacuate Israel. And I think that I'm curious about your opinion, Ben. We know that Russia has a relationship with Israel, and in many ways it kind of has to, because there are so many Russians who live in Israel. I believe it's about 1.5 million. It's a big number. Now, there's also the fact that over the course of the years, whether it's Russia's assistance to Syria during the dirty war there, or whether it's the fact that it has built, as you said, this relationship with Iran that has only gotten stronger. Now they're strategic partners. There are rumors that, and still, while it can't be confirmed 100%, talks about Iran supplying Russia with certain capabilities, ballistic missiles, etc., as well as Russia providing Iran S-400s, for example, to be able to shoot down any kind of potential Israeli-U.S. Aerial incursion into its territory. What do you make of this, given this latest development that we're hearing about Israel? What it seems like Israel is angry about these developments. I'm curious about your thoughts about how this is all developed.
Yeah, well, we've seen Russian-Iranian relations grow closer and closer in recent years in all sectors. Of course, we now see potential military cooperation. We've actually seen joint military exercises between China, Russia, and Iran, which is like the warmongers in Washington. That's their worst nightmare. But another point that's less noticed is economic integration. Russia and Iran have become very close in trade and in infrastructure development. So, of course, China has always played a key role in this as well. But there also are other projects that don't even involve China, like the INSTC, which is a transport corridor that goes south and connects Iran through to Russia, and then potentially could go to India as well. So China, of course, has its own economic infrastructure connected to Iran and Russia. It's part of Belt and Road, and also just in general part of the energy infrastructure, gas pipelines, trade routes, railroads. But Russia and Iran have also been developing their own infrastructure that doesn't even include China. Not that they're trying to exclude China, obviously, but the point is that they have many different forms of connection. And the reason I mention that is I'm trying to emphasize that Russia's relations with Iran are not only Russia, China, Iran relations. It's not only the three of them together, but it's also just Russia and Iran, which is very interesting because, again, as you mentioned, Russia and Israel had decent relations until a few years ago. Of course, the war in Syria was another big factor in worsening those relations because Russia helped to save the Syrian government from being overthrown by Salafi jihadist extremists who were backed by the West, including the US, European countries, many of the Gulf monarchies, and Israel. The former chief of the Israeli military admitted that the IDF and Israeli intelligence had been supporting the so-called rebels in Syria who were linked to extremists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And we now know that ISIS got many of its weapons from the US and Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda was being armed by the Gulf monarchies and Turkey, and also got weapons from the US. So Israel played a key role in alliance with the US and the West and the Gulf against Syria. And of course, Russia was allied with Iran and Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance, to defend Syrian sovereignty. And that's the reason, really, that the Syrian government was not overthrown and taken over by these extremists who came close to taking the capital, Damascus. So Russia, was playing this very complicated geopolitical role where it was still had relations with Israel, which allowed it, for instance, to sometimes try to de-escalate and to negotiate between Iran and Israel. But at the same time, Russia did play this important role in helping to protect forces in the region from being overthrown by the US-led imperialism. Now, I think we should also understand that Russia has played an important military role. You mentioned, so I just talked about the commercial, economic ties, the political ties, but also military. And I suspect that we only know a tiny fraction of what Russian-Iranian military collaboration looks like. There are allegations that Russia has provided hypersonic missiles to Iran, and that allegedly some people say that they were used in this Iranian strike, this counterstrike against Israel after Israel has carried out numerous attacks in Iran. I think that honestly, the military collaboration, only a tiny fraction has been publicly disclosed, and I really do suspect that Russia and Iran have much deeper military cooperation than has been publicly disclosed. And I think Israel probably knows that. We know that Israel's spying on everyone. The US is spying on everyone. But of course, it's not really in their interest to exaggerate at this point, because if they do that, then that's only going to further deepen these Russian-Iranian ties. So, we're so used to this idea that Israel is this, unbeatable superpower in the region and no one can come close. But as Iran has shown, establishing deterrence in this attack, Israel claims to be so powerful, but the resistance forces in the region are also very powerful. They've been able to establish a deterrent, attack Israel, and especially if Russia has been providing more advanced military technology. I think, Israel's qualitative military edge, the term the U.S. always uses, we must ensure that Israel maintains the qualitative military edge. Well, that assumes that the U.S. technology is much more advanced than anything that Russia has. And of course, we see in Ukraine that that's not true. Russia does have some of the most advanced military technology, and I think it's likely that it has shared some of that with Iran.
Yes, indeed. And this latest development that kind of highlights everything that you said, this increasing cooperation between Russia and Iran, as well as what is very real, I think, while they had a decent relationship, as you said, Russia-Israel relations, I believe it's even worse on the China side, China-Israel relations. I do, ever since this genocide launched a year ago, it's quite clear that there is a huge cooling and chilling effect that's had on the actual bilateral relationship between Russia and China and their relationship with Israel. Now, I wanted to just remind the audience too, and maybe your last comment on this. There was an interesting in 2023, last year. there was an interesting report coming out. This was before the genocide began, where Amir Whitman, who's a part of the Libertarian Caucus of Netanyahu's Likud party, literally went on Russian media and said Russia will pay the price for supporting Israel's enemies. Israeli weapons should find their way to Ukraine. And those enemies, of course, are supporting Iran, supporting the people of Palestine to any significant extent. Of course, always accusing this of being support for Hamas. So it's not as if there isn't ill feelings among certain sectors of the Israeli, I guess you would call them the political establishment. Your final comments on this, Ben?
Yeah, well, I couldn't help but notice that when you saw these reports that Israel hit a Russian, first they claimed it was a Russian air base in Syria, and now they're saying that it was a Russian warehouse for ammunition and weapons. When we saw these reports, I couldn't help but notice that the Ukrainian media was amplifying this and was positively gleeful. And certainly in Kiev, many Ukrainian officials who just obediently follow whatever Washington tells them, they have been pushing to increase relations with Israel. Now, Israel, because it knows that it's isolating itself everywhere, countries all around the world want nothing to do with this insane genocidal rogue regime that is just at war with everyone in the region. So Israel, at least there are no level-headed politicians in the Israeli government. They're all just insane maniacs. But they understand that with their relations with Russia, they shouldn't completely sabotage those relations. So in the past few years with the proxy war in Ukraine, they've been trying not to openly ally with Ukraine. But we all know that Israel has been supporting Ukraine. And certainly Ukraine has been overtly supporting Israel, making no pretense, not even pretending to care about the Palestinians, not even pretending to recognize the sovereignty of the Palestinian people. So it's funny because, Israel and Russia have this relationship where it's obvious that they really do hate each other, but they still kind of publicly try to maintain these, formal ties, and they don't openly criticize each other usually, although their media outlets are constantly criticizing each other. It's a very, very toxic relationship, if you will. And eventually it's going to get to a breaking point. We see that Israel is becoming so isolated internationally. It's really the US, and even in Europe, only a few countries that are willing to openly support it. And for instance, if you look at the recent UN General Assembly vote on that call for the implementation of the order by the International Court of Justice that demands an end to Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. This is not a controversial resolution. It's saying that international law must be respected and Israel must end its illegal occupation of Gaza and the West Bank within 12 months. And it should be within one day. But anyway, the point is that you look at this vote, 2/3 of the world voted in support of it. And then about fewer than 10 countries voted against it, which is 7% of the UN member states. And it was the US and a few proxies. What's interesting about that vote is that even in Europe, several countries in Europe voted in support of the resolution, including France, Spain, Portugal. So the reality is that increasingly, and I should mention Ireland, of course. Ireland has been strongly supporting Palestine. So even within Europe, there are more and more countries that are finally willing to speak out against Israel's genocide. Of course, on Ukraine, they're all in lockstep. I'm not trying to praise these Europeans, but the point is that Israel is so isolated that it's really the US that is the only country that has the power to prop up this horrific genocidal regime, which is on the border of economic collapse. Its GDP shrunk by over 20% last year, and that's honestly a very conservative estimate. So the reality is that the US is propping up this regime, and it's clear that, yes, it does have formal relations with Russia, but those relations are at rock bottom, and we could potentially come on the verge of seeing them completely break. I mean, Russia is not just going to abandon Syria and Lebanon and some of its, and certainly Iran, which have become its allies. And at some point, even if Russia and Israel do want to maintain relations, at some point, the larger geopolitical context means that they're going to have to break off relations, because Israel can only continue to operate because of U.S. support. The U.S. is providing the weapons and ammunition and artillery shells that Israel needs to continue carrying out these genocidal wars. Without U.S. support, Israel collapses. And that means that if the U.S. tells Israel at some point, it gets to the point where they have to break off ties with Russia, they will. It's a matter of existence for them.
Yeah, certainly, as this where we began this conversation almost insinuates that it's very easy for any kind of major war between Israel and Iran, of course, Israel being the one to spark it and to wage it. It's very easy for that to lead into Russia getting involved, not least because the entire, whether it's Syria or Iran, Russia has really robust relationships with these countries, and it's just impossible for their assets not to be hit, and as well as their interests to be massively affected, not least the fact that any kind of Israeli retaliation, which I believe Iran, I think people should start believing in Iran when they say they will hit harder, that should Israel go along with, let's say, hitting oil fields, that will massively just absolutely crash the market. And that really hurts. That is not something Russia necessarily wants to see. So all of this, I think, points to a very, very, very dangerous situation. Of course, it's the U.S. and the Israeli
Danny,
side that are dancing
I'm
on
sorry
it.
to cut you off. There was one other detail that I had forgotten to mention, which I think is
Go ahead.
important when we're talking about this very complex kind of relationship that is not really a relationship, but it's formally a relationship between Russia and Israel, but we all know that it's mostly on paper. Let's not forget that also in the past 2 years, the Ukrainian regime has been constantly complaining over reports that Iran has been providing drones to Russia. It's another very important detail here. We talk about Russia's military support for Iran, but Iran has been providing some cheap technologies that Russia has been using. So basically, Ukraine has been, just shouting, saying that Russia is in this alliance with Iran. Why does it have ties with Israel? Israel knows this. I mean, again, we know that Israel's spying on everyone. They know that Iran has been providing these drones to Russia. So again, it's one of those things where Israel is so isolated, they don't want to completely cut off everyone, but they probably will at some point, because this insane rogue regime is just on such a rampage that it really is becoming like Rhodesia or apartheid South Africa. I mean, inside their politics, they are like that. We all know that Israel's an apartheid regime, but I'm saying internationally, diplomatically, toward the end of the Rhodesian regime and the end of apartheid in South Africa, these regimes were so isolated internationally. They were just destroying all of their diplomacy abroad, and I expect that to happen in Israel.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.